So welcome to the second of 3 webinars in our High Street series, High Streets webinar series. So this one is entitled Who Controls the High Streets? And we've got another fantastic panel for you today. So please do feel free to ask questions and put questions to them in the Q&A box. Ben, who you can see at the bottom of the screen there, will be working through the questions and putting them to the panel. Do feel free to chat to other participants using the chat box. But the Q&A function is to put the questions to the panel, so that's the one that will be monitored. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Power to Change website shortly afterwards. So I will hand over to Alba Magnabola, I've done it, I knew I would, who's going to be chairing the session, and she will introduce all the panelists. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you, Lucy. Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Alba Magnabola. I'm the Head of Research and Policy at Power to Change. Today's webinar looks at who controls the high street, but also very importantly is asking questions around how we can increase community involvement and community engagement on the high street. It's one of a series of events, as Lucy mentioned, next week I'm really pleased to mention that we will be holding our final event, sort of drawing together everything we've discussed so far. Talking about the new Civic High Street, what that looks like, and we'll have Danny Kruger MP, Bill Grimsey and Professor Kathy Parker from the Institute of Place Management. So I think that should be a really cracking event to come to this time next week if you can. The reason we've been interested in how land ownership is structured on the high street comes out of work we did last year, where we looked, among other things, at who owns the high street and what those ownership rates mean for high street development and vacancy rates. And obviously there's motivations and pressures that drive landlords, the different types of landlords. We have local authorities, investment trusts, private owners, and obviously those pressures are not always the same as what the local community wants and needs, and it can be very difficult to bring those things together and make it work for a place. So the people we have on our panel today are going to talk each quite briefly about that topic from their different perspectives. First of all, we'll have James Child. James is going to give us a little overview from work that he does on high street ownership, actually looking at the data, who does own the high street and how does that break down. We'll then have Councillor Asima Sheikh from Islington. She's the Executive Member for Inclusive Economy and Jobs. She'll be able to talk about Islington as a local authority high street owner and what they've been doing there. Matt Sofair from Legal and General, he's the Research Manager for Legal and General Investment Management. We'll talk about their perspective. And lastly, but not least, we'll have Mark Robinson, co-founder of Alandi, a developer, but also, of course, chair of the High Streets Task Force. When they've finished speaking, we'll open the floor to Q&A, and I'm really hoping we'll have a good discussion given the number of people we've got on our webinar today. So without further ado, James, I'd like you to kick off.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for the introduction, Alba. I suppose, oh, here are the slides. Excellent. So, yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I'm James Child and I'm Head of Retail and Industrial Research at EG. For those of you who don't know, EG is the leading authority on real estate news, data and analysis. You know, we've had skin in the game for well over 150 years, and unbelievably, I've actually been part of the business for almost a decade now. More to the point, I collaborated with Power to Change last year, as Alva mentioned, on their report, Take Back the High Street. And that really investigated how putting communities in charge of their own assets can act as a real conduit to regeneration, and listed some of the benefits that a different approach to place management and to localized proprietorship can really have. So I've been asked to share some of that data with you all today. Next slide, please, Lucy. Thank you. So ownership of real estate has always been part of most discussions that we have, especially when it comes to regeneration. But certainly in recent years, the conversation has sort of shifted onto ownership in a very real way, and that's coincided, of course, with the challenges that particularly place and retail have faced over the past 10 years or so. And unprecedented is one of those words that we've all heard far too much this year, but the other one has accelerated. And I make no apologies in lifting this from another presentation that I've heard, but when you take into account the relative direction of travel, moving from the proliferation of internet shopping, consolidation of stores, CVAs, administrations, and now a real upward recalibration of property values, that acceleration has meant that a traditionally slow moving industry like ours, real estate, hasn't really been able to keep up the pace of change that we need. And that has, ultimately culminated in some, and I do stress some here actually, because I know that Mark's on the call, fractious and fraught relationships between tenants and landlords over rental obligations, because of that real, very real value perception. And this is, of course, has all come to a head with the extension of the moratorium this year, and the ongoing debate about, who can afford to pay what. And that's why I think, collaboration's never really been more important than right now. And one final point on this slide before I move on is that, the value that we place on bricks and mortar has unfortunately really become bound by the pound. And, I think that instead should be, there should be a real representation of value to the community that it actually serves. Next slide, please, Lucy. Thank you. So I'm going to try and use this slide to unravel our findings. Do bear with me because I know it looks like a bit of a car crash, so I'm going to do my best to try and run through it and make some sort of sense. Unfortunately, without animations, it's going to be tricky, and anyone who's watched Chris Whitty and co over the past few months will know exactly what I mean. But first off, some important criteria to run you through. You can see at the bottom there of the screen under the chart. In this investigation, we looked at 22 high streets across 11 cities and over 3,000 stores. Okay, so column A on the far left obviously signifies landlord type. That's fairly straightforward, and it aligns pretty well with most industry standards too. Column B, that shows the overall ownership percentage of all of those 3,000 odd properties that we analysed. So I've pivoted the table in such a way that the highest percentages are at the top end of the chart. So you can see REITs at the top there on 21.4%, down to overseas investors on 17.3%, and so on and so forth. So I think straight away what this really does is it gives you an idea of just how fragmented ownership is and can be. That in itself can be a stumbling block to regeneration, because you've got a hell of a lot of different people and stakeholders invested in the makeup of our built environment, all of which are going to have very different priorities. And I'm sure that the panel will speak about that in more depth. When it comes certainly to curation, but also regeneration as well. Column C, the third one along, that goes a little bit deeper, and this column really seeks to identify the percentage of all of the vacant units in the study by ownership type. So, as I said, all of those 3,000 units, which ones were empty and who owned them. So some of the headlines within the numbers are that shops owned by overseas investors are more than twice as likely to be vacant as shops owned by the public sector. So the data does, really suggest that public ownership of high streets leads to fewer empty units, especially compared to those owned by private interests. And finally, that column on the right-hand side, column D, that shows something slightly different. And this is the overall percentage of each specific landlord's portfolio that is empty. So, for example, you can see that only 4.5% of the public sector and 6.8% of units owned by the social sector or the traditional estates, compared to 9.2% of real estate companies and so on and so forth are vacant. So it's a bit of a can be difficult to get your head around, and hopefully I've done my best there without the animations. But I think the top line here is really that real estate companies own 1 in 4 empty shops within this study, and overseas investors own 1 in 5. The public sector, on the other hand, and social sector own about 1 in 10. And obviously, I'd just like to add before I move on, this study was undertaken last year, so it's subject to change, and you need to bear in mind that it is from a small data set, and this isn't a nationwide picture, so there will be regional and geographical variances. But vacancy is an extremely important barometer to the prosperity of place, so these figures are very important. Next slide, please, Lucy. Sorry, I know I'm So I'll try and rattle through this. So, you know, the current crisis is obviously very worrying. I think that there are hopes for a better model of placemaking going forward, though. Yes, there are concerns around increasing vacancy rates, about reduced footfall long term, you know, whether that will pick back up to pre-pandemic levels or not, and obviously a slowdown in certainly multiples opening new stores. It might be a different story for independents, which is good news. But there are some concerns. You know, towns and high streets have already been at the sharp end of austerity since the last recession. So, you know, it could be tough. And towns, especially compared to cities, which there seems to be quite a lot of talk about at the moment, do have a much higher percentage of retail stock within them. So that's going to be worried too. But I put that stat on the slide there because that really shows just, you know, how important high street regeneration is. 80% of all retail space in the country comes on high streets. It's a huge amount of space. But obviously, you know, the next part of that quandary is, you know, we do probably need less retail space. So what's the best way out of that situation? How do we begin to, you know, reimagine that space effectively? So the idea, you know, of socially responsible real estate is surging, and you know, we've already seen some great examples in the most recent Power to Change report as well, which is fantastic. I've actually been lucky enough to go and visit Ashford this year, at some point in the past. It all blurs at the moment, doesn't it? And you know, they've got a fantastic team down there. They're doing an absolutely amazing job at you know, re-engineering and reworking space, and it's, you know, it's a really great example, and it's proof that a combination of leadership and determination and a real plan really can work. And I'm just going to add one final micro plug before I leave. You know, I'm sure most of the conversation today is going to be around pride of place and you know, localism. I'd urge you all to read our latest report by my colleague Graham Schoen. It's called Shifting Working Patterns, and I can send a link around for that later on. But it really takes a deep dive into looking at how the pandemic has already and will change our, you know, the way that we work, what that means for offices, what that means for cities, but more importantly for our local towns as well. So I think, you know, just before I sign off, you know, the hope is that we are looking at a prevailing decade in which more inclusive, more socially responsible, and certainly more localized economy is going to be the norm and create better places for us all. So on that note, that was probably more than 5 minutes, wasn't it? I'm sorry. Sorry, Ava.
Thank you very much, James. Asima, we'll go straight to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. I've got loads to say, so I won't say it all. 5 minutes isn't a lot. Just really want to say that our work with landlords and high streets is evolving, and you've just mentioned excellent examples from other councils such as Ashford, and there's lots to learn there. And it's also worth saying that context means everything. So this conversation in the context of Islington will be a different kind of conversation when it comes to places outside of London, or even in other places within London, in other boroughs. And the main thing for us is the very high land values, and that shapes landlord behaviour. And so that sets a particular challenge for us in Islington, in that landlord behaviour might not always align with what our vision of a high street or a locality would be. But what I'll come on to is how we think that we can take a collaborative or an influencing role with landlords. So our challenge is really gentrification, and it's a bit of a conflict over who's the high street for. That is a key question for us. Who owns the city? Who is the high street for? When I took the portfolio, I kind of inherited a inward investment, Richard Florida kind of outlook, and we kind of like resisted that quite strongly, to say we're not going to work from a basis of deficit. There is talent in our communities as it is. We don't need to, even though everybody's welcome, you know, and new communities are welcome, and your artisanal, you know, soda bakeries and all of that, absolutely. But that can't be the only focus, and you really do have to give back to your community. There is talent in our local community, and what are we doing to support that? We're not working on the basis of deficit, and that's what we've kind of challenged straight off, is that kind of dominant discourse about how you renew. We don't use the word regeneration either. How do you renew a place? So it's about an inclusive economy, community wealth building, bottom up, community-led economic development, a grassroots-led approach, which puts inclusivity, social justice and sustainability at the heart of it. And it's our affordable workspace programme that we've used. Most of that is actually through our developer negotiated Section 106 agreements, where we secure space at long leases for 10, 20 years at peppercorn rent, and we pass that peppercorn rent on to a provider to do stuff and deliver us social value, which is benefits to local community. What we did is that we adapted that for a town centre, Finsbury Park. We applied for the Mayor of London's Good Growth Fund, match funding 1.1 million, to do two things, because we were realising that we needed to interfere and influence into the town centre if we wanted to help shape it. Otherwise, gentrification was just the market left to its own devices. Landlords want to get the best profit and the best returns. There is a certain model that enables them to do that in certain city contexts. So that's fine, but we thought actually this is going to push out the local community. Finsbury Park, very poor, very deprived, and incredibly ethnically diverse. Blackstock Road, the centre of the Algerian community, not only in our borough, but the whole of London. It even goes international. Seven Sisters Road, our Somali community. People travel from all over. Stroud Green Road, it's a mixture of ethnic grocery shops as well as some of our destination restaurants, which are known. And Fonthill Road, we call it our Fonthill Road Fashion Village. Our Black and minority ethnic communities from all over London travel to Fonthill Road to buy kind of like party, garments, dresses and tuxedos and other things. We're very much wedding. We wanted to speak to that, to say that that's a value. What can we do to preserve that? And we have this massive new development coming in, and we know their objective is to. If anybody's been to Upper Street in Islington, I love Upper Street, but I know all the people in the council estates around there don't go and shop there. They get on a bus and go further out to somewhere that's affordable. So we want to make a place that's for everybody. So affordability is really important. Local, accessible and affordable. So we purchased 2 long leases, first floor of above a retail unit, because landlords were trying to convert those into housing. We didn't want that change of use. We wanted to keep employment in the town centre. So we thought, well, let's show them, rather than have, let's work with the landlord to say, give us the long lease. Let's show you that this is a viable option, that you can make a return. This is pre-COVID, but actually it might, post-COVID with, people still want to get out of their houses for mental health purposes, so it's a tech space. And I gave it a peppercorn rent to a tech cooperative called Outlandish. And we said, go forth and create more tech cooperatives. And we also said, but, we don't really just want you to do tech for tech's sake, because the tech sector is predominantly very highly educated white men. So we said, actually, we want you to work to get more of the local community, get women, Black and minority ethnic communities, and our local people in there. And we wrote that into our social value agreement, said, have it rent free. We want you to deliver all of these things in return. Then on the ground floor, a retail space, which we launched the tech space last year, this year, the retail space. And that again was a real intervention in the local high street, because it was in decline. Landlords were struggling. And the landlords there were a mixed bunch. Some really cared about the tradition of the fashion garment sector. It really matters to them. They really did care. Others a bit more not so. So we thought, let's work and show. I mean, there's a lot to be said for somebody coming in and caring and saying, actually, we do really care about it. And it helps lift the morale of the rest of the street. So who did we get to do it? We got I've only got 1 minute left. Fashion Enter, who's a social enterprise. They are well established in the garment making business. We connected them to local women sewing groups and saying, train them, get them jobs, get them to start up their own businesses. But really importantly, would you engage with the other businesses on the road to raise their game? I mean, it could be a losing battle, but we really felt that there was an issue there around helping to develop the garment cluster. So what I'll finish on is, I do really think that there's a role for local authorities to intervene and to try to do these kind of projects which try to show other options and alternatives, and to actually do that. The audience is landowners as well, to say actually this is a possibility and it can help revive the high street. And just finally, the last point, we know that we need to up our game in terms of community involvement in high streets, because high streets are not just commercial centres, they're community and neighbourhood centres. They're really important for our local community to have somewhere to go to connect, to socially engage with other people. So we're thinking, and we'd love to learn from other places on other examples and how they've brought the social back into the high street. Thank you. Sorry for going over.
That's okay. We didn't give you very long, but we're really keen to get to the Q&A and get everybody else involved. So I'll move on, let Matt speak a little bit about his perspective, and then we'll finish with Mark.
Great, thanks Alba, and afternoon everyone. It's great to be part of this discussion and be able to kind of explain a little bit more about the business I work for, which is Legal and General Investment Management, and I guess what we see some of the challenges being on the high street, and I guess what we see our role being in terms of helping to create, I guess, better places for people fundamentally. So a bit of background about the business. So we're one of Europe's largest institutional investors. We invest in lots of different asset types. The bit that of the business that I sit within is the real assets business, and we invest in infrastructure, corporate debt, and also direct property. So we are a landowner, and that covers off offices, logistics, residential, and obviously retail as well. And that could be retail parks, it could be supermarkets, but also high streets and shopping centres within that. And we do also invest our balance sheet within town centre regenerations in a number of instances. Prior to, I've been at Legal and General for 2 years. Prior to that, I used to work with a lot of operators on their strategies. So I like to think I've got a kind of broader perspective in terms of those two sides of the coin. I think before I go into too much detail around, I guess, and it kind of links into what we see some of the challenges being within the sector, I guess it's important to just stress that, you know, institutional investors like Legal and General, often we're not actually investing necessarily our own money. We're investing on behalf of our investors, a big chunk of whom will be pension funds, which are obviously responsible for paying you know, people on this call incomes throughout their retirement. So it is everyone's money who's kind of investing in the high street, and we obviously have a responsibility to our investors to make sure that we are we're investing their money in a responsible way, and we're making sure that we're trying to provide ultimately secure long-term investments and income streams as part of those investments. So that context is really important to understand, I guess, some of our historical motivations, but also, let's be completely frank, I guess some of the challenges that retail finds itself in, and that desire for those kind of long-term secure income streams has resulted in this state that a lot of UK retail finds itself in, where we've got these very homogenous high streets filled with, you know, seemingly secure national retailers, which have ultimately decoupled themselves from, I think, local communities. And I think that is certainly something which has to change. And, you know, we are very cognizant of the fact that we need to be part of that solution. So I guess in terms of how we see our role as starting to resolve this, and what some of our key focuses are at Legal and General, I guess, firstly, you know, a big thing I think across the retail property sector is there does need to be a cultural shift from owners. One thing that we often talk about is moving our role from being a librarian who collects rents and cleans spaces, and moving that towards being an editor who has a more active role in the high street, in our town centres, and has that kind of direct relationship with communities, as opposed to kind of outsourcing that to the occupiers of our spaces. And that really requires us to have a bottoms-up approach, so really understand better the needs of the local community, as opposed to what creates the best investment. And ultimately, a lot of the time, what creates a better investment is a place that means something and actually it has an engaged local community. The second part that we kind of see our role as doing is around operations, and a big thing that we're looking at is traditional leasing models. We've recently introduced a new kind of framework which involves 3 options. One which is a kind of flexi, really short-term plug-and-play space for more local independent operators, whoever that might be. Second model is around kind of more operational leases, ultimately turnover leases. And then also flagship leases, which is all around those kind of, still those kind of longer term leases for more secure operators. So that kind of operational piece is a really important facilitator of the first element that I spoke about, which is trying to create great places for people. And then I think the final thing that we're really focused on is being a lot more intentional about our role in the local environment, and being much more intentional about the social impact that we create. We own some of the shopping centres that we own are the kind of heart of local town centres. And we've got a real opportunity there to use our scale to, I guess, create more localised supply chains through everyone who works in association with these shopping centres. And it helps, I guess, ultimately support and grow these local economies. And, a key thing for us is as part of that shift, the uses that we introduce as part of our retail places definitely does not have to be retail. It should be a blend of workplaces. So Asma mentioned about making sure you've got employment in your town centre. That's really important. It can be community spaces, and we need to be a lot more creative in terms of thinking around how we go about doing that. And some of the other pieces are really integral to making sure that becomes embedded within our day-to-day processes. So that's kind of a bit of an overview from me. Obviously happy to answer any questions later on.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. Mark, if you'd like to bring up the tail of the discussion, and then we'll open to the Q&A.
Cool, thank you. It's great to be on such a strong panel as well. It's wonderful to hear Asma talk about the passion that she has for place and what Islington's doing. And also I know from my many touch points with Legal in General that they really are, when it comes to institutional investors, one of the good guys. But I'll quickly talk about the duality of my existence that I referenced on Twitter. So many people involved in this, and many of the people tuning in will know me from my role in the High Street Task Force. Just to quickly explain, the High Street Task Force is the entity that's been put in place by MHCLG to help place, develop skills, capacity, information and collaboration to deliver change in town centres and high streets. It's been in place for about a year. I've been the chair for about 3 months. A lot of that's been me getting to know the wider network better, inviting new people onto the board who I felt could add value, such as the one and only video from Power to Change, because it's that important to get all the voices who are contributing to what should be a successful regeneration place having a voice at a national level. The next stage of the High Street Task Force is going to be even more interesting. We've now got 150 experts in place, which we can parachute into place, and local authorities who are lacking in that capacity and lacking in their expertise to drive change. So we can really start making a difference now we've done our COVID response. My day job is not wholly unlike some of Matt's colleagues at Legal in General. So Alandi is one of the UK's, if not the UK's biggest operator and investor of retail assets, privately owned operator and investor of retail assets. So we own and control well over £1 billion worth of assets in 30 locations across the UK. Interesting enough to reference James's slide, I think I've probably got an investment partner that ticks every single one of those boxes. So we work with pension funds, we work with private equity, we work with global private equity, we work with banks, we work with charities. So I can genuinely give you a bit of a view as to whether or not there is, because I think the implication from James's research is that different types of investors behave in different ways as a group, and it's not true. I can only blame it on my own personal experience. The idea that private, and again, I hear this spoke, and Bill Grimsey will say this tomorrow, and this worries me. There's almost a demonization of private investment. There's a demonization of foreign ownership of high streets because there's this implication that they care less. That may be the case, that may not be the case. The only thing I know is that one of the shopping centres that we own that's got 100% occupation is owned by a Luxembourg company. So I would welcome a really open debate about how we manage to reconcile the two things of local need, community-driven change, but the need for national capital and international capital. Because one thing I am absolutely cocksure of is that challenge that we have in place, the levelling up agenda that's needed in the UK, is, like Sir Bob Kerslake has suggested, akin to the reunification of Germany when the Berlin Wall came down, and that cost 1.8 trillion euros. Now, Matt's business, I don't think you have a trillion under management. You may have, but anyway, they're not going to put it all into our high streets, that's for sure. And the other thing that is also, the other reason I wanted to get involved in the High Street Task Force was it's in place for 4 years, and the government is genuinely, whether you agree with their politics or not, they are putting proper money to play. The Towns Fund and future High Street funds do amount to £3.6 billion. They are funding Power to Change with hundreds of millions of pounds to affect change within our communities. There is some proper money coming to play, and that is something that I wanted to be involved in to make sure it was invested in the best way it possibly could be. But if you compare that to the challenge, the £1 trillion challenge, should we say, it doesn't even touch the sides. And unless we can have a pro-investment environment within our towns and within our high streets, within our places, we won't get the change that our communities desperately, desperately need. Thanks.
Fantastic. Lots of food for thought there. Thank you all very much. Right, we're going to open up to Q&A, so I'm going to turn to Ben for a little bit of help about questions. I'm going to use Chair's prerogative though and put my own one first. And I just thought, so you all talked about sort of accelerating trends, and I wondered how COVID and the pandemic has particularly affected how you manage high streets at the moment, but also how you'll do that in sort of the next, I don't know, 18 months to 2 years, and how that might make it more or less easy to engage with communities and local need. Anyone wants to take that?
I'll have a go. I don't know if I'm very knowledgeable. Our different town centres are different in terms of the offer, and so that's been impacted by COVID. So where we've got real kind of hospitality at the early days, that was really quite impacted quite significantly. But then the very local town centres have done really well. I mean, well, different businesses have had different experiences. And we, as a council, went around and set up a directory to let people know who was delivering. We try to do it straight away, and to get that out through the mutual aid groups. We had a lot of local residents really upset for the local restaurants and shops, and they pushed us to say, what are you doing to help the high street? So we've still got a town centre kind of officer role in all our town centres, so we got them out to talk to the businesses and to see what help do you need in adaptations, what help do you need with deliveries, how can we market stuff for you. And we're going to do even more of that by setting up websites and to improve the online directory, and also help some delivery services. I don't know if that helps to answer.
Thank you. Mark?
I think one of the benefits of the absolute crisis that's been caused with COVID is it stopped the high street from being a boiled frog, if you stick with me. So we've done nothing but look after town centre high street properties for 12 years at Alandi, and we could see the massive structural changes that were going to be happening in our high streets over the next decade, maybe 3-4 years ago. And we positioned our business as an agent for change, as opposed to being a defender of the status quo, which I think put us in a pretty good place to be coping with what's going on at the moment. But one of my major concerns is that the town centres and the high street were suffering death by 1,000 cuts. We were that boiled frog, if you know the analogy, and we would never have leapt out. Unfortunately, with COVID, change has been wrought upon us in months that would have taken that decade. And as a result, the crisis is of such a magnitude that dramatic change has to happen. And again, to pay tribute to Matt's new colleague, Dens, who runs the retail team at Legal & General, I'm not quite sure whether they've got their heads around quite how little their shopping centres are worth, but to try and address the challenge, they have led the way in putting in place a brand new leasing system, which for an institution which is supposed to be the sort of the sleepy giants who own retail real estate is really quite impressive. It has meant that the government is paying attention, but as far as we have travelled with the change agenda, as far as the fact that people like Power to Change are involved in the agenda, and you wouldn't have been maybe 12 months ago, means that change is happening. But to make change happen properly, we need to fundamental change about everything we do in our town centres, around the commerciality between landlords and tenants. Certainly, you know, we need reform of rates, we need reform of insolvency law, we need reform of the way we actually structure leases to allow creativity and flexibility and to allow places to thrive. And landlords shouldn't be afraid of change, because thriving places are worth more. People who are trying to hold on to what's gone by are the people who will lose, deservedly.
Thank you very much. Ben, do you want to feed in some of the questions from the Q&A?
It was extremely quiet to begin with, and then about a million came in all at once. So I'm going to try my best to get some to you. Lots about collaboration, lots about gentrification. There's been some interesting ones here around the idea of collaboration. So we can start actually with Vidya, who's CEO at Power to Change, has said, can there be synergies between private ownership and community ownership rather than seeing them in opposition? We need private capital, but how could it work better to support a community role and community ownership? There's another one here from Chris, which also looks at collaboration. For Matt, really, how is the investment attraction in the high street to institutions right now? Is it stable, or is it up, or is it down? Certainly active town place management appears to need some collaboration. One here for Azima, how do you work with landlords to bring in a change in an undesirable tenant mix? It's quite an interesting one. And a couple of related ones here about sort of geography. So one from Chris, what's the difference really between towns and the hinterlands and then the city centres in this debate as people begin to work from home? And Tom talks also about the 10 to 15 minute neighbourhoods and what the challenges around that are as well. So lots there.
Right, we'll try and take some of those. So Vidya's question around private capital, I mean, Mark, perhaps starting with you, but what is the way then for us to sort of, I had a conversation last week with some people from the British Property Federation, and it was similarly, I was very conscious that we don't actually want to try and set these things up in opposition. You know, but it must also be very difficult for private owners to engage the community and to know where to start. So what are your thoughts on how that could be made?
I think, to take it away from it just being a private sector, I think community engagement has been appalling by both the public and private sector in place. I don't think you can look to the planning system and say that there's exemplars of great public consultation that arise from that, or that local authorities necessarily have their ears the closest to the ground all the time. It's something we've done really badly as an entire industry that we really need to resolve. And what we tend to do is ignore people at the two ends of the spectrum. We tend to ignore the voiceless people who have to use our place because they're probably not as politically engaged. They're probably not digitally native. And at the other end of the spectrum, what we tend to ignore are the people who don't have to use place because they've got all the options in the world. They can order stuff online, or they can get in their car and go somewhere else. So it's the people that you have to engage with if you don't, and the people you want to engage with you can't. They're often ignored. And the other thing that really does concern me, and this will speak to Asma's points that she's made, is a lot of the placemaking agenda, a lot of these events that I attend, the agenda is different from a very middle class sensibility, whereas a lot of the problems and challenges are in places which are far from middle class. So, you know, if I attend another event where it's suggested to me that the answer to every single town is a food hall or an artisan baker, I might lose my otherwise Gandhi-like calmness, because it's not the answer for everywhere. And it really actually disturbs me. What we'll do is we'll get rid of these clone towns that nobody loved, which were full of high street brands, invest millions, hundreds of millions of billions of pounds, creating clone town, middle-class clone towns that nobody wants either.
Yeah, I think Mark touches on a very important point there, about and Asma mentioned it as well, about the regeneration, not gentrification. I've spoke to so many people at different layers of stakeholdership up and down the country about exactly this. And, I think we are all guilty of thinking that, if we replace all the empty shops with coffee shops and, give people a place where they can remote work, then everything will be fine. We don't have to worry about the community and the unemployment rates and the deprivation and all of the other things that I think are probably the most important issues we have to address. And that we're supposed to be on a journey of levelling up. I don't know if that's good. If we now have the financial or political will to do that like we wanted to now, or if the government do. And I think that I think Matt touched on it as well. The bottom up approach of addressing some of the issues that we've got at the moment, especially in our town centres, is going to have to come right from the bottom. And there's no point in, and I think Mark, like you just said, pumping millions and billions of pounds into doing, concreting over again what we've already done and the mistakes we've made. So, whilst there are some, pretty grim challenges out there, I think if we, it seems to me like we are on the right track, and, ownership of property has to be part of that conversation. So that's kind of my two cents on that, I think.
And just to add to that, I guess if we're waiting for a government bailout for all our town centres and all our high streets, we're going to be waiting a long time. And that's why I think it comes back to what Mark said earlier, which is around it. We do need genuine partnership, we need genuine collaboration, and we need, you need the private sector involved in it. We need also the public sector to help manage that transition, because also, no one can have a longer term view than the local authorities, who are obviously so invested in those towns for the long term. But there's a lot that can be done to work together, and more that can be done to work together to create these better places. And one of the questions that I think Ben put forward was around what's the institutional landscape in terms of investing in retail. And I guess at the moment, the institutional landscape in terms of investing in retail is that it's not particularly positive towards investing in retail. But if you ask us the alternative question, which is what is the institutional and certainly legal and general's attitude towards investing in the UK's real economy and UK town centres, then you get a very different answer. And I think that's a key thing. We do need to move away from kind of typecasting our town centres, and we do need to look at a broader view of what town centres are for, and make sure we're being adaptable to bring in different parties, including obviously communities, because ultimately communities need to drive what that vision looks like.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the event we're holding next week is talking about that. So there's been a question in the Q&A about what do we think the right mix then is? What does the perfect town centre high street look like? Which is actually something we want to try and pick up a bit more next week. But it's that not getting marred in the past, isn't it? It's actually thinking about town centres aren't going to be retail only in future. So actually we have to start thinking about that future mix. Asma, did you want to just pick up the specific question around difficult tenant mixes and what you can do about that?
I didn't understand what that meant. Difficult tenant.
Undesirable tenant mix, I think was the turn of phrase. Ben, can you help us?
Yeah, that's right. How do you work with landlords to bring in a change in an undesirable tenant mix? I guess it's your definition of what undesirable means, right? Yes. But say it's all betting shops and charity shops, and you don't see that as necessarily meeting the needs of the local community. I guess the question comes from that.
Well, that's a really difficult one, because we don't, it's where do we have powers and where do we have an ability to influence and tweak? That would require national government legislation to not allow charity shops the amount of leeway that they currently have. But then that's a whole bag of, problems there about, how would you debate on that? The only thing I can say is that we can only lead by example. And what we can do is try to bring in and support activities that we think is really important. So I've already given you the examples of how we're trying to intervene into, and also we were trying to develop clusters, economic clusters that would deliver skills and employment. So it's not just an experiential experience in the town centre. It's actually going to lead to people getting jobs, people getting, earning money, spending money, etc. But in terms of, there was another question around, who creates the outdoor space? And I think there's a role there as well, because if you do want town centres to be a space where people come and hang out, because if it's moving towards an experiential activity in town centres, if predominantly retail is going online, what are the other uses for town centres, or what can you do? And how can you make that inclusive? So we've talked about one of our, let's get in touch with our community centres. This is pre-COVID. Let's talk about linking in with a department store, and would they do a tea and cake afternoon in the piazza, and we could help tackle social isolation of our elderly residents, but also get them into the shops, get them into the town centre. How can we, through our public realm, put in some kind of like communal spaces where it allows you to do that? In Chapel Market, for example, we were talking about that before, because our markets need help, to attract different types of people. And I think that's what we're seeing, that the role of the local authority is to be a bit creative in providing and facilitating. Another person asked the question about how do you get the bottom up, and it is community development. It is the council getting out there and rediscovering our community development skills, and helping our local businesses. It's in a partnership with our local businesses, and we'll get in touch and say, what could you offer if we did this? How can we help? We'll get you on the directory. Could you offer a discount if we got some, local groups along, etc. So our town centre, or we call them local economy officers, they've been given the task of go forth and do community development as well as economic development. And it's a new area, and we're learning on that. And just on the question of the tri-borough, Finsbury Park is tri-borough. We hold a town centre group across the 3 boroughs, and we invite councillors from the 3 boroughs, officers from the 3 boroughs, and businesses from the 3 boroughs, and we start the conversation that way. We haven't solved it because it's really complex managing a town centre across 3 boroughs, but it's the mechanisms, the engagement and the democratic mechanisms that you've got that allow people a voice. I'll stop there.
Alva,
Yes.
if I may, because you said something, and something's come up in the questions about what does the perfect town centre look like. The question itself scares me witless, because anybody who believes that there is a perfect town centre, or is there one model for everywhere, is off on the wrong footing. There's one secret to successful places, and they're places with purpose. Places with a reason to exist, that know about their identity, know what they're there to perform, know what purpose they fulfill for their community. They're the places that thrive. So whenever we operate as a business, and whenever we get engaged as a high street task force, we talk about vision, we talk about purpose, and they're the secrets to thriving places. And to get there, you need engagement from all of the constituents, using all of the uses that are appropriate for that place to make it thrive, to fulfill its purpose. So I think sometimes we look down the wrong end of the telescope at these things. Start with purpose. If you want to spend 17 minutes and 38 seconds of your life, Google Simon Sinek, it starts with why. If we apply the same rationale to place and think about why a place exists, why people should want to go there, why people love it, and expand from there, we'll get to where we need to be quicker than we will just thinking, what uses can we cram into town centres?
Yeah, I completely support Mark on that point there, but we definitely don't want to be going from one clone retail town kind of set up across the UK economy to another one which is, I don't know, clone co-working, retail, coffee shops, artisan bakeries. As we said before, it does need to come from that local economy, that local community to help feed into what the perfect town is for that particular place. And I think that's a really key point.
Yeah, and I was struck, so the research that we did recently with the LSE, looking at sort of community businesses and community involvement in high streets, it's the surprising diversity of what you get depending on the place, you know, or what the community came together in those places to do. And I mean, some cases you've got straight retail, you've got shops selling sort of, you know, a lot of kind of creative industries, people from the local community coming together. But you've got real variety in what ends up being plugged into the high street, and working collaboratively with other businesses as much as possible, you know, not trying to sort of push out the rest of the high street, but actually saying there's plenty of room in the high street, especially as retail shrinks, there's plenty of space to plug this sort of stuff in. Ben, do we want to do, with sort of 8 minutes to go, should we look for another couple of questions before we wrap?
Yes, absolutely. There are lots here. James said, I love the fact that Islington is combining economic development with community development, and it brings us on to a whole raft of questions, actually one from Danielle here. What's the panel's view on how landowners and landlords can best engage with local communities to find those interesting tenants and uses? There are quite a few of those that are just sort of seeking ideas from the panel about how better, with Mark's comment before about the fact that this is not done well so far, how we can sort of better engage with local communities to find those new uses.
I can certainly say a couple of things from my perspective at L&G around what we're trying to do, and I think we need to try and move away from this kind of centralised model where people work in offices in London know what's best for towns across the country. It just doesn't work like that. I think we need more decision making from people who are on the ground, who are really tied into the local community. And we've had, you know, we're working on a few initiatives in Poole where we own a shopping centre in Poole, and some of the, you know, some of the feedback and some of the involvement we've got from local businesses who want to engage with a new independent high street that we're creating there has been absolutely phenomenal. But we wouldn't be able to get that kind of interest with someone, you know, an agent in London trying to contact local businesses. It has to be someone who knows, you know, who's successful in that local place. You know, how do I communicate with them? They've probably already got the relationships there, and it makes a huge difference having that kind of local insight, local presence in terms of making that right decision. And then the other element around that is I guess also is just listening. So again, it's not just about one person making a decision, listening to people who use the centre, listening to people who don't use the centre, and understanding, or the high street, and understanding, you know, what do they really need, what are their challenges, and how can we try and start to fulfil some of those requirements.
James, you were going to come in there.
Yeah, you kind of stole a march from me there, Matt. I was kind of going to say exactly the same thing. So, so thanks. But I think going back to one of the questions there about you know, engagement of community is, you know, I think, I mean, I'm not a place leader. I'm not in local government, so I don't, you know, I can't say that this is the absolute truth here.
Anyway.
You know, in my mind, if you have to have an exercise in communicating with the community, then you're probably like, you should know your community and you should know the people that live there, and you should know what their local needs are. And there are some, you know, some real success stories out there of leaders who have done that. And you know, we go back against this point about gentrification, which you know, I know that we're all too long in the tooth when we're talking about this for far too long to go down that road again. But there is that worry, and I think that you know, there's also a place for, you know, what people like myself might define as, you know, bad retail. I mean, I don't think there really is too much bad retail if it serves a purpose to the community that it belongs to. You know, like value shopping, for example, you know, it gets a real bad rep. But, you know, they're used all the time and people need them. And as, you know, as Emma said, you know, people, you know, I go down Upper Street for a few pints sometimes, but I probably wouldn't go there to buy my bread because I'll go somewhere else. So it's a delicate balance. So I think that we keep coming back to this point about local leadership, and it really is about that, and having boots on the ground. And those are the guys that are really going to understand exactly what, you know, community needs. So, but I think, you know, after what appears to be a rant, I think there are a lot of people out there, and, you know, the High Streets Task Force especially seems to have mobilised a lot of these, not only experts, but people who've got real passion. And I think that passion is something that is shining through, which is brilliant.
There's another one here around absentee landlords from Helen, and it really speaks to something that Karen says. It sounds like making yourself known to a landlord would be a start. I have no idea who most of the landlords are in my town. I know that there was a thing in the Select Committee report last year about the idea of a register of beneficial interests for commercial property. Maybe the panel could talk about, you know, what an absentee landlord means for a town and what the sort of reputation that gives to landlords.
Having defended foreign ownership of the high street, I do absolutely think there should be a register of beneficial owners. I know from my own personal experience of trying to drive change in place, if you cannot get hold of the ultimate owner of somewhere that you need to drive change, it is, well, it's more than frustrating. It frustrates you being able to do anything. And that's something I hear repeatedly when I liaise with local authorities across the country as I travel around with the task force. So it's a major thing the government could do at zero cost, or very little cost, should we say, to really help promote change.
Yeah, and it has been committed to. I mean, that register of beneficial ownership or beneficial interest was committed to, I think, last year. But, you know, obviously, you know, various things have happened in the way. But I think it's one of the things we can do after this event is bringing some of those questions back to government through the task force and saying that was committed to. That really is, it's an important plank. Data and transparency about ownership is something that's really quite easy to do, and it would make a huge difference. Okay, we have more or less out of time, so I just wondered if anyone on the panel had any final remarks they wanted to make.
I like ending on a positive note, and I just want to re-emphasise, as with the pullback of retail as the anchor to our town centres, and that's undoubtedly what's happening, because we've got purposeful shoppers who don't need to go to their high street to do all of their shopping. The most valuable uses for me as an investor are the uses that bring people to town centres, because it's about going to where the people are, not bringing the people to you these days. And the most valuable uses that drive the most footfall are often community uses, you know, be it healthcare, for example. Yeah. So there is this commonality of interest. So I think when we start thinking about purpose and what works in place, we can actually imagine these places where there is great alignment between public and private sector, community use, private ownerships that creates thriving places that works for everybody. I think there really is an exciting future there.
Thank you, Mark. You've done my summing up. That was excellent. It just remains for me then to thank everybody, all our panelists, for joining us and giving us the time today, and thank everyone else in the audience for sticking with us. I found it fascinating. We're having an event next week, as I mentioned, and after that we're going to sort of reflect on everything that came out of our 3 events and pull that together into a report and some policy recommendations to make to government to talk about just what we've learned from discussing this topic, you know, quickly over a number of weeks, and what we think needs to be taken forward and considered through the task force or through other means. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully see some of you next week.